U.S.-China relations are under the spotlight once again as tensions over the South China Sea continue. The two sides are holding talks in Beijing. But how far is Washington willing to go to find a solution? And how will China respond? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem, Sika. Well, there are lots of issues that divide the world's two biggest economic powers, the US and China. Territorial disputes in the South China Sea, trade practices, currency concerns. But every year, hundreds of Chinese and American officials meet to discuss their differences and try to find solutions. President Barack Obama launched the forum with the aim of building trust between the two powers. Before we bring in our guests, Al Jazeera's Adrian Brown sets up the big issues at this year's talks.
Well, the China-USA dialogue was begun by President Obama, and this will be the last one under his watch. It's essentially a forum where officials from both countries get together and focus on those areas where the United States and China have things in common, like fighting climate change and combating terrorism. But I think on the Chinese side, there is now a sort of growing realization that the dialogue could be in jeopardy if Donald Trump becomes the next president of the United States. Mr. Trump, of course, has accused China of raping the economy of the United States and has warned that if he becomes president, he would impose punitive tariffs on almost all Chinese imports. So China is very worried about that prospect. But overhanging the dialogue today has been that one big area of disagreement between the Obama administration and the government of Xi Jinping here in China. It is the rising tensions in the South China Sea. On the eve of this dialogue, the US Secretary of State John Kerry warned China not to implement its air defense identification zone. Now, if China goes ahead with this, it would mean that military and civilian aircraft would have to register with Chinese authorities when they fly over parts of the South China Sea. And remember, China claims almost all of the South China Sea. Mr. Kerry has said that if China does go ahead with this, it would be a provocative action and it would create a lot of instability. Now, nobody seriously believes that there's going to be war in the South China Sea, but it certainly doesn't feel like peace at the moment. This is Adrian Brown for Inside Story in Beijing.
Well, the dispute in the South China Sea has been a central point of tension in recent US-China relations. The US has challenged China's claims in the region and has increased its support for some of the other countries involved. 6 nations are involved in the dispute that centers around the Paracel and Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines and Taiwan have overlapping claims to this territory, but China claims most of it. Although the islands are largely uninhabited, they sit on vast oil and gas fields. They also have some of the region's best fishing grounds, and control over the islands would also mean control over vital fishing routes. $5 trillion worth of sea trade passes through these disputed waters every year. So time now to bring in our guests for today's discussion. In Beijing, we have Einar Tangen, political affairs analyst and economic affairs commentator. In Paris, François Godemont, director of the Asia and China program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And joining us from Singapore via Skype is Simon Long, Banyan columnist for The Economist. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Einar Tangen, let me start with you. What do you expect from these talks this time around?
Actually, I don't expect very much. I mean, there's really a tremendous amount of tension that's going on between the U.S. and China. I think it's on both sides. I think the U.S. has been very provocative in terms of its actions and the flyovers, the sending of the military, and China is reacting very, very strongly to this.
Do you think this is kind of a lame duck session in a number of ways? I mean, because we're talking about President Obama, who is about to leave office in less than 6 months. We have, as I understand it, these talks are generally on the Chinese side being generally dealt with by technocrats and people who aren't as close to Xi Jinping?
Well, I think that would be a mistake. I mean, these talks are being very, very closely monitored by the top leadership of China. Obama, yes, definitely. Lame duck. I mean, with all of the candidates signaling that they would change U.S. foreign policy, perhaps only slightly in the case of Clinton, I think it's very clear that this is not going to be a productive session. Let
me turn to you then, Francois Godemont. What's your take on all of this? As we've just been hearing there, this comes at a time of increasing tensions between both China and the U.S. Over a number of things, but in particular at the moment, this ongoing dispute over just who has control rather over these islands in the South China Sea.
Yes, that particular dispute about sovereignty, by the way, is not with the U.S. because the U.S. takes no position on sovereignty. The dispute with sovereignty is with the neighboring Asian states, 4 of them plus Taiwan plus China. What is with the U.S. is the interpretation of UNCLOS, the Convention of the Sea, on freedom of navigation. And I would disagree with the preceding speaker that, yes, the U.S. is very firm in principle, but in practice it hasn't done that many phone ops, and it has sort of fuzzed the issue between exercising freedom of navigation in economic zones and exercising what is called innocent passage for warship in territorial waters claimed by China. And the third dispute is really going to be arbitrated by the Permanent Court of Arbitration of the UNCLOS Tribunal. And it's about what rocks, features in the area may qualify as, shall we say, as genuine territories, islands creating rights, and what doesn't. And that doesn't necessarily mean they belong to China, but it's of course very important to the topic as China both claims them and maintains that they create new rights, without specifying them, by the way.
Simon, I know you wrote a piece on this very subject in The Economist this week, in which you remarked that part of the problem here is that the United States and China are too busy talking at each other, talking over each other, rather than having a kind of meaningful dialogue. Just expand on that and explain why you see it that way.
Well, I think we've heard from our previous 2 speakers the sense in which that is true of the South China Sea. I mean, what we saw this weekend in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue was the 2 sides really demonstrating just how far apart they are, even on agreeing what is in dispute in the South China Sea. From China's point of view, it's a simple dispute about sovereignty between it and various other claimants in which the US has no position. That's clearly oversimplistic. The US has an interest in the freedom of navigation. From the US point of view, although it emphasizes it's about the freedom of navigation, as China points out, the freedom it seems most concerned about is its freedom to send its surveillance ships and planes into or over waters that China claims as its own. And we've seen no coming together or getting closer of the 2 sides on in any interpretation of this. So as the previous 2 speakers have said, we seem to be getting further apart, and that is going to cloud these talks this week in all the other areas of potential cooperation which the 2 countries are exploring.
All right, well, we're going to hear from 2 of the high-level officials involved in this. The first is U.S. Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, who says that China's actions in the South China Sea are not in its best interest.
Unfortunately, there's growing anxiety in this region and in this room about China's activities on the seas, in cyberspace, and in the region's airspace. Indeed, in the South China Sea, China has taken some expansive and unprecedented actions that have generated concerns about China's strategic intentions. And countries across the region have been taking action and voicing concerns, publicly and privately, at the highest levels in regional meetings and global fora. As a result, China's actions in the South China Sea are isolating it at a time when the entire region is coming together and networking. Unfortunately, if these actions continue, China could end up erecting a great wall of self-isolation.
But Chinese officials say the U.S. should not take sides in this dispute.
The US approach towards the South China Sea has in fact changed a great deal since the 1990s, from neutrality back then to limited interference, and now to active intervention by taking sides. How come? The United States takes sides with whoever confronts China in claiming the South China Sea. It becomes the biggest troublemaker who alleges neutrality in word and takes sides in deed.
All right, so let's talk then about this issue of the air defense identification zone, which is something that China has talked about. Einar Tangen, what do you think is at stake here, both for China and the United States and the other countries in that region?
Well, it's a really sad situation. I mean, both sides are increasing tensions within that area. I mean, what we should be looking at here is trying to de-escalate what is, in fact, a very, very dangerous situation. I mean, the U.S. is thinking that they are, in essence, trying to contain China, and I don't think that is the case. China sees this as an absolute strategic imperative. If you go back to historical terms, Germany and Japan in the First World War, the Second World War, what was happening in those instances, you're seeing a repeat of this. And this is a real shame. I don't understand why the statesmen on the U.S. side and the Chinese side don't see that they are drifting into a very, very dangerous situation.
Francois Godemont, I mean, China has neither denied nor confirmed that they would implement this air defense identification zone. What do you think would prompt them to implement this, and why would they even feel the need for something like this?
Well, first of all, this is something they have done over the East China Sea, and although it has raised the opposition of almost all neighbors from South Korea to Japan to, of course, the US, it is proceeding. It's not necessarily implemented very thoroughly, but I think we can guess that civilian passenger ships, for example, passenger planes, tend to register rather than not, just to be on the safe side. So this is an extension. What would cause China to do it, I think, would be overreaction to the coming adjudication by the Court of Arbitration, which almost everybody estimates is going to deny China and to approve at least part of the Filipino claim. That is a loss of face. China does claim, as the previous speaker said, history over law. The US argues law, as do others. The US weakness, of course, is that it has not ratified UNCLOS, which is an inherent problem. But one could see that China could well declare the ADIS, not necessarily implement it thoroughly, but take another step for the future.
Simon Lang, what's your take on the what is at stake for the nations involved in this air defense zone, and what China's motivations are for it?
Well, I think it would be quite a dangerous step in that it's, firstly, China's claims in the sea are clouded in a deliberate ambiguity. It claims an historic cartographic feature called a 9-dash line, which gives it sovereignty over almost all the sea. But it's never made clear, and has deliberately avoided saying, whether that is a line which just means that it has sovereignty over the land features within it, which might conceivably be in accordance with UNCLOS, or whether it gives it sovereignty over the waters as well, which would be completely outside the scope of UNCLOS. Now, if it declared this ADIZ, it would be claiming the right to control access to the airspace over territory or waters claimed by numbers of other countries. It's inconceivable, I think, that the Americans in particular could recognize it, and so they would presumably continue to fly in defiance of it, and that would raise the risks of a deliberate or accidental clash.
Einar Tangen, how much is this about? We've certainly seen a more robust foreign policy from China over the last few years, it would be fair to say. But it does seem as if some of the rhetoric has been ramped up a little bit in recent years, and that's coincided with a kind of economic, not stagnation, but it's certainly not growing at the same rates as it was before. Do you think those two are related, and how much is this about feeding nationalism at home?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to say that this is directly related, but I can tell you that as China feels threatened and the U.S. continues to put pressure through a kind of proxy game, whether it involves Taiwan, the Philippines, or Japan, China will continue to react. And this is not something that's up for discussion. China feels very threatened by what it sees as an encirclement policy. And despite all the legal issues, as the previous commentator said, the U.S. is not a signatory to UNCLOS. And yet it seems to be pushing this idea that other people should abide by it. Remember, international law is not a law itself. There's no enforcement mechanism. It is a coalition of the willing. So if this does not go the way that China can accept, they can simply withdraw.
Well, one of the concerns that's been raised in China as well, Francois Gaudemont, is the possibility of a Trump presidency in the U.S. I mean, that was certainly laughed off a few months ago, but it may be a distinct possibility. We simply don't know at this point. And of course, there is this very aggressive rhetoric that we've heard from Donald Trump about what he would do if he was president, raising tariffs against Chinese goods and so on. How worried do you think the Chinese are about that?
I think the paradox is that they are worried by the two leading candidates. They are worried by Trump, if only because he said his number one principle in dealing with China would be unpredictability, which is probably what the Chinese hate most. But on the other hand, there's always been something of a difference between Hillary Clinton and President Obama in that Hillary Clinton has always been a little more principled, both on human rights and on maritime issues at times, probably a little less practical. We don't know to what extent she would shift the US policy, which basically has at all times under the Obama presidency attempt to preserve engagement and dialogue. And so they're faced with a totally unknown candidate, which is Donald Trump, and somebody which they know only too well and whom in all other circumstances they would rather avoid.
Simon, how do you think the Chinese will be looking at the U.S. presidential race right now and the possibility of either a Trump or Clinton presidency?
I agree with Francois. I think it's a lose-lose election from their point of view. There was a moment when Chinese commentators seemed rather to relish the Trump candidacy for its sheer improbability as an example of precisely what was wrong with democracy, that it could throw up a candidate like this. But now that they've had to take him seriously and look at what he said, as Francois says, his unpredictability makes him a very undesirable candidate from their point of view. And as for Hillary Clinton, she has form in China. As way back in 1995, as First Lady, she was in Beijing at the United Nations Women's Conference making a speech that her hosts found distinctly unfriendly. And in fact, they date their problems with the region in the South China Sea to Hillary Clinton's intervention in Hanoi a few years back as Secretary of State, when she declared America's national interest in preserving the freedom of navigation there. So they really will, in many ways, be very sorry to see the back of Barack Obama.
Einar Tangen, we talked quite a little bit about, up to this point, about the various tensions between the United States and China, many of the things that they disagree on. But what areas do you think that they can find common ground on, and can they be used to build on that?
Well, I think the main issue is economic development. The world is in malaise right now, and people are looking for some signs of hope. unless China and the U.S. can sit down and try to come to some accommodation about the minor political issues, the economics will suffer. I mean, remember, we're talking about rocks in the sea, the South China Seas. These are really insignificant pieces that are being put together and made into a major issue. I mean, from the Chinese perspective, the whole issue of the 9-dash line is very ambiguous. It is also ambiguous to the West. I mean, trying to push this now when all the economies are struggling to kind of continue and go forward. You look at the Fed and what they're doing. It doesn't seem to make sense that this should be the primary issue of difference between the U.S. and China.
Francois Godemont, where do you see issues of common ground here?
Well, I agree. The biggest question mark is really what the Fed is going to do about the interest rate of the dollar. That's probably the single issue most important to the Chinese. Unfortunately, that doesn't really depend on a dialogue between the Secretary for Treasury and the Chinese administration. It's the Fed, and it's a different decision. But that is hugely important because if the rates go up, the dollar goes down, and the renminbi happily stays down too. If the interest rates go up, the dollar goes up, and then the renminbi has a problem, or the U.S. has a problem because there is devaluation of the renminbi. The other issue on which there could be common ground is still Korea, the Korean Peninsula. It's clear that the U.S. has relied on China's acceptance and hopefully implementation of UN sanctions, and it has not been completely disappointed, but that game has been played for now literally 2 decades, 25 years actually, and has never yielded the results that were hoped for. So the areas of strategic cooperation are more requests for China not to be obnoxious, not to intrude, rather than very positive cooperation.
Yeah, Simon, Francois there talked about dealing with North Korea as something that the US and China can find some common ground on. But the Chinese are worried, aren't they, about the collapse of the North Korean regime as a result of the sanctions. So are they more worried about the effect that those sanctions could have, or are they more concerned about North Korea getting nuclear weapons?
I think they're in a bind at the moment, that they clearly are completely exasperated with the Kim Jong-un regime there and its refusal to listen to them and to ease tensions on the peninsula. On the other hand, as you say, I think their worst fear is not a nuclear-armed North Korea, which they've allowed to develop. It is the collapse of North Korea in chaotic circumstances, which might lead to a humanitarian disaster, floods refugees across their border, and ultimately to Korean reunification with American troops on their own border.
All right, just in the last minute or so that we have left, Einar Tangen, I'll give the last word to you then. How do you see this playing out over the next few months, and whoever the next president happens to be? Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
At this point, I'm very pessimistic. I mean, you're looking at Donald Trump, as was pointed out by previous commentators, a wild card. If it is Clinton, it'll be pretty much stay the course with the Obama doctrine or the lack of an Obama doctrine. I think it's been pretty much a vacuum that they've reacted to. So that's neither situation is good. What we need is really a strong leader who has a sense that the U.S. and China have to interact in a responsible way.
All right, on that, we've got to leave it. Thank you to all three of our guests, Einar Tangen in Beijing, Francois Godemont in Paris, and Simon Long in Singapore. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.